moving your export controls program further along in your company. So let's get started. So in prior programs, we've talked about the highlights of the export administration regulations for commercial products and technical data, as well as the international traffic in arms regulations for governing. Excuse me for just a moment. We're correcting some technical difficulties here. Anyway, typical programs in the past have dealt with the EAR and the Itar. We've talked about definitional issues such as who is covered by the regulations and what transactions are covered. Certainly, compliance best practices and penalties and enforcement trends have been part of discussion in past webinars. Some recent topics, including a roundtable discussion a couple of months ago, included export reforms, the changing jurisdictional reach of both the U.S. munitions list in the ITAR and the commodity control list under the export administration regulations, Russian sanctions, cloud computing, and other topics. Today's program, I'm going to do something a little bit different than I've done in the past. We're going to focus on fundamental export controls analysis for business change. So what do I mean by business change? So many times export controls issues come up in my practice as a function of a company's change in business. Either a new product has been developed, a new order has come in, a new product is being manufactured or is being developed within your company. And due to these changes in your established business practice, many export controls issues arise. So what I'd like to do today is to focus on what does a company do, what kind of fundamental analysis might you go through in the event of new orders, new products, new processes within your company, new manufacturing technologies, and other kinds of developments that may happen within your company due to simply internal development or because of customer demands. So what we're not going to cover today is this is not going to be an in-depth discussion of product classification, nor an in-depth discussion of licensing or filing submissions to either the Department of State or the Department of Commerce. All of these topics would take much longer time, potentially days worth of discussion. But the goal is to cover enough topics so that, or enough information on a topic so that companies know when and where to do a deeper dive into issues. So today I'd like to focus on what happens when products change. My suggestion is that as a company that may be a manufacturer, an assembler, a developer of technical information or products that involve U.S. export controls, you first need to recognize and have embedded within your company structure an employee or employees or a procedure that allows your company to identify and recognize when product change has happened, and also to start the internal discussion of what is implicated because of that product change. And again, product change may mean a change in your internal processes, your manufacturing techniques, orders that might come in from a customer. Secondly, when your business changes, does your company have also embedded within your structure, within your procedures, within your policies, within your fabric, what I call structural decision points These are places, points in time when in your business process that there are people and structures in place to identify product changes and then to evaluate those implications for manufacturing, for customer support, for accounting, and also for regulatory compliance, and U.S. export controls compliance being one of those areas of regulatory compliance, and the topic that we're going to look into more detail today. Thirdly, is export control compliance a decision point already, or is it at all a decision point within your company's policies and procedures? I would suggest that if you're an exporter, a manufacturer, a company that in all handles either commodities or technical data subject to the International Traffic in Arms regulations or the Export Administration regulations, the EAR for commercial products, the Itar for military products, that your company needs to have decision points in your policies and procedures so that you can identify when things change and to see if those implications include export controls issues. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go along about what's a decision point, what kinds of information are needed, and so forth. But certainly that information is going to involve, when a product changes or when a business changes, sales and marketing information, logistics information, how are we going to manufacture this new product? But also, is there more information that we need either from within our organization or from customers or vendors that would help us comply with U.S. export controls requirements? And those are the requirements and compliance information that we'll touch upon in more depth today. Lastly, as part of this checklist of what should your company do when your business changes or your products change, is you should be determining, is this new product, is this new order, is this new process that we're instituting within our company something that is governed by the Export Administration regulations for commercial products and technology, or the ITAR for military technical data and commodities. As some of you who have listened to this webinar in the past may recognize, I often frankly borrow from a friend and colleague the phrase that determining whether your new product, your new process, whether the business change within your company implicates either the Export Administration regulations or the ITAR is your first decision, and probably the most important decision that your company will make in terms of going forward with that business change and that new product. So determining jurisdiction is crucially vital. So let's make sure that we understand that I'm going to be talking about the process of determining jurisdiction. It may involve classification of a product, but it is by no means only classifying your product. Product classification under the U.S. export regulations may bring your product under either the EAR or the ITAR, but the process of determining jurisdiction goes really beyond just determining what your product classification may be. So let's look at that in a minute. First, let's just make sure that for those of you who are new to export controls, that you understand there are two sets of regulations governing the U.S. export controls regime. The commercial products and exports of commercial products are governed by the Export Administration regulations, or the EAR, established by the Export Administration Act in 1969. The Bureau of Industry and Security of the U.S. Department of Commerce is the agency that administers these regulations. And they govern, as I've said, commercial products, services, and technology. Dual-use products, dual-use items, is a term that you will find often in export controls compliance. So that we're clear on what that definition means. Dual-use products are commercial products that may have a military application. They are not products or technology that varies depending upon whether it's commercial or military in application, but it's actually fundamentally a commercial product or commercial technology that, unchanged, can also be used in a military system. Years ago, I was informed by a colleague that in the B-52 bomber, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of commercial parts and components. But because they were unmodified for military application, they were dual use in nature and commercial products governed by the Export Administration regulations. Fast forward to today, the F-22 Raptor, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, both state-of-the-art fighter aircraft, also have thousands of dual-use products within them, even though they're considered state-of-the-art aerospace and aviation products. Military exports and military products are governed by the ITAR. The ITAR was established in 1976 through the Arms Export Control Act. And DDTC, or the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls of the U.S. Department of State, is the agency that has jurisdiction over the ITAR, well, I should say administers the ITAR, and is the agency through which the ITAR is enforced. Again, the ITAR governs defense articles, services, and technical data. The hallmark of the ITAR and determining whether something is under the ITAR rather than the EAR is whether products have been specially designed or modified for military application. We'll touch upon that later in today's webinar, although we've gone into that in more detail in previous webinars. Now we'll talk about just a couple of basic definitional items. One is what's an export, and I mention that again for those of you who might be joining us for the first time or who are new to export controls. Exports are not simply only something that gets sent across our national border to another place, but they do include shipments out of the U.S., but they can be physical as well as electronic. And pressing a button on your keyboard, just as much as sending a parcel through a common carrier across the border, are both exports. Also vitally important is a third category of exports, which are called deemed exports. And these are a release of technology or technical data to a foreign national who is within the United States, and a release that is not authorized under the U.S. export controls regulations. So deemed export violations are certainly a third category of exports to be aware of and to be avoided, unless you want to face one of multiple U.S. export controls enforcement agencies. What's a re-export? The U.S. export control regime is established to ensure as much as possible that exports out of the country or to foreign nationals within the country are authorized, and that in turn, once items, commodities, and technical data, once they are outside the U.S., are not re-exported. In other words, they are not transferred from the authorized destination and recipient to a secondary recipient or location, whether it's within that that country of receipt or in a third country. So both the EAR and ITAR require documentary and procedural requirements to ensure that re-exports or transfers from the place of receipt are only done in accordance with the regulations. So let's move on to a favorite topic for many companies, which is who's an exporter versus who must comply with U.S. export controls. Now, an exporter is fairly simple. A person in the United States who has the authority of a principal party in interest, a term taken by the export regulations from the customs regulations, and that person and that entity determines the control of sending of those items outside the United States. Now, an exporter could be a direct shipper or an owner of a product. It could be an individual or a business entity. It could be a contractor in temporary custody of a product, or an entity or business providing services with regard to that item. It might involve a contract manufacturer, a company whose only contact with that product may be to build to print for a customer. It could be a consulting engineer, or it could be even a data center or a cloud services provider. All of these kinds of entities and individuals can be exporters. They can also, even though they are not a direct exporter, they can still be subject to U.S. export controls and be required to have U.S. export controls compliance programs. We'll talk about that for a little later on as well. So one thing I want to impress upon companies who are wondering, our business has changed, we have a new order, we have a new customer, we have a new project. What are our initial duties? Well, first of all, besides recognizing that you have a business change, as we talked about before, you have a duty to notify and a duty to inquire. What's the duty to notify? The duty to notify is first to recognize that you are subject to U.S. export controls, to notify your customer, and this can be not only a requirement under the export control regulations, but it also can be a sort of a marketing advantage for your company versus competitors. When you tell your customers, we are fully compliant with and knowledgeable of U.S. export control requirements. We can handle your products, we can fabricate them, we can ship them, we can do what's necessary to do business for you, with you, and to provide services that you require in compliance with U.S. export controls, and you need not have any concerns about improper disclosures or leakage of technical data, proprietary information, and U.S. export controls governed information to unauthorized third parties. You also have a duty to inquire. You have a duty to inquire of your customer. For instance, if we're not the owner of the information, but for instance, if you happen to be a contract manufacturer, as many companies in our area are, you need to inquire of your customer. Does your customer know whether the product, part, or information they're sending to you, or that product or part that they're asking you to fabricate or manufacture, what's the nature of that part or component? Do they already know whether it's classified under either the Export Administration Regulations or the ITAR? Can they provide you information on who the foreign recipient might be, what will its end use be, and so forth? And so, as I mentioned before, taking an example of a contract manufacturer, if you find out from your customer that that product that you've been asked to produce, that you've been asked to manufacture, is subject to the ITAR, you need to have an export controls compliance program consistent with and compliant under the ITAR. And the ITAR says that if you're simply manufacturing and brokering ITAR products, as well as directly exporting them, but key for contract manufacturers is to understand that any form of manufacturing brings you as a contract manufacturer under the ITAR and subject to the regulations of the International Traffic in Arms regulations if you are manufacturing in any way an ITAR product or dealing with ITAR technical data. So what's manufacturing mean? It's a very broad term, really undefined in the ITAR if you take a look at section 122.1, but through informal guidance from DDTC, we've come to understand that manufacturing has been very broadly interpreted by DDTC to include things such as traditional manufacturing and fabrication activities, but also things such as polishing, coating, ancillary services to the actual manufacturing of a part, and that coating or painting of something could also be considered manufacturing under the ITAR if we're talking about an ITAR-governed part or component. And to be an ITAR-governed part or component, that part or component should be listed on, or would be listed on, the U.S. munitions list. That part of the ITAR, which lists in 21 different categories, defense articles, defense services, and defense technical data called technology. Also, one thing to note that as a contract manufacturer, if you are dealing with classified information or information that the U.S. government has deemed to be important and restricted for national security purposes, there is a manual called the NISPOM, the National Industrial Operational Manual, that governs classified information related to products for which you might be providing services or manufacturing. Certainly, if you are in the chain of custody of a commercial product, remember that even though it's a commercial product, commercial products are also restricted for export control purposes if they contain sufficiently important commercial technology and information. So the audience should remember that U.S. export controls capture both U.S. military technology and parts and components, as well as important high-level commercial products and technical data. So under the ITAR, you're required to have an export controls compliance program. If you are a company dealing with parts and components and technology that is licensable under the Export Administration Regulations, although you are not required under the commercial regulations to have a compliance program, it is highly recommended both by the U.S. government and by people in the field, because whether or not you have a compliance program for handling commercial products can be a mitigating, or it can be an aggravating factor if there is an enforcement action involving your company, even though it's a commercial product. So compliance programs are generally helpful, if not essential, for both commercial and military products companies. Who are the agencies involved? The agencies involved are noted in this next slide. Everyone from Commerce for commercial products, Department of State for military products, Department of Treasury for export controls on foreign entities or individuals who might be sanctioned for political or economic reasons, and the U.S. Customs Service, the agency that handles clearance of items and technology at the border, and who also have separate enforcement authority regarding export controls matters. So, again, going back to our original premise today, what kinds of actions, what kinds of questions, what should a company do when their business changes, when their products change? So I always go back to, as a starting point, what are the critical facts that you as your company need to determine when your business changes? And what are those important bits of information? Well, it's the who, where, the what, where, who, and really why kinds of questions. What's the product or service? Whether it's something you've developed internally or something that you've been asked to fabricate by a customer. Where is it going? Is it going to Kansas? Is it going to the EU? Is it going to Pakistan or China? All important questions. And again, who will receive it? Who are the intermediate and who's the ultimate consignee? Intermediaries and as well as the ultimate consignee. It may seem almost a trivial point, but substantial fines have been levied by both DDTC and BIS on companies who have simply failed to determine whether either an intermediary or an ultimate consignee is on the consolidated screening list, sometimes called the denied parties list, which is a master list of individuals and entities, both U.S. and foreign, who have been denied export privileges and denied privileges to be involved in any way in U.S. exports. So, lastly, you should be asking, what's the end use of this product? Again, whether something's being used for a commercially a purely commercial reason, or for a dual use purpose, or for some kind of strictly military application, has a tremendous bearing on whether the jurisdictional reach of the Itar or the BIS export administration regulations is the appropriate set of regulations. I'm going to skip over the next section. Provides some information about the EAR and how it's structured. I think in the past we've talked about the export administrations as a more specific list and a more specific description of technical functionality of products, services, and technology. The ITAR, and this is an example of some of the separate ECCNs or classifications dealing with products. As you can see, the export administration regulations can go into a lot of detail regarding specific technical functionality and specifications of products and technology. The ITAR, on the other hand, is a much more broadly worded textual description of defense articles and defense services than the EAR may be. The reason for that is to provide the U.S. government the maximum amount of flexibility to declare that a particular product or technology is subject to authorization before being exported out of the U.S. Again, here's an example of the Itar and the way it is constructed. You'll see that it's much it's a much denser but broadly worded description of products, and it's also a much shorter document. We'll go into the export administration regulations and the ITAR in more detail. I should mention that in January 7th and 8th, in just another month, there will be a major ITAR seminar sponsored by PNDC and the U.S. Department of Commerce in Portland, Oregon, and we'll talk about that at the very end. So let's move on a little bit just to address a persistent question from many companies, which is, what do we do when our businesses change, when our products change, when new orders come in from our customers, and what do we do? Where do we start with regard to determining, is our product subject to the EAR or the ITAR? Well, what I would like to do is to refer you to a section of the Export Administration Regulations, which is Section 732. 732 is basically a chart. It's a two-page chart which can be helpful in enabling a company to get past the initial sort of wonderment as to where in the world do we begin as to whether our product is subject to the ITAR or subject to the EAR. I think most companies in our area deal with a combination of both commercial and military products. I would say also probably a vast majority of them, commercial products comprise the lion's share of business for their companies, with ITAR products and technology being a relatively smaller part. Section 732, which I've duplicated here in this slide, and I apologize to the audience that the slide is a little bit hard to read because the printed matter in the Export Administration Regulations, as well as the online version, are also not very clear. So this is probably the highest resolution we could get it for the slide. Suffice it to say that what this slide does is that it takes you through a step-by-step process so that the company employee can say, all right, so are our products subject to the EAR because we're dealing with proliferation of chemical or biological products, weapons? Are we dealing with products that are subject to export or re-export because of requests from the U.S. government? Does the export consist of when they say pre-recorded phonograph records and other things, they're talking about public domain information and publicly available educational information that may not be subject to the U.S. export regulations. And so what Part 732 of the Export Administration Regulations does is it takes a company through a list of questions, and in answering those questions you can determine, are our products subject to the Export Administration Regulations or are they outside the Export Administration Regulations? Typically things that are outside the regulations are educational materials, public domain materials, materials that have been published, such as patented information and so forth. But what it also does is it directs a company to ask, if it's not subject to the Export Administration Regulations, is it subject to the jurisdiction of another agency? And that other agency often is the U.S. Department of State and products that are military in nature. But to move on to the next slide, if in going through the first part of the chart in section 732, a company determines that, well, it looks like we have a commercial product, and it looks like our product is correctly positioned under the Export Administration Regulations. Now what? Do we need a license or don't we need a license? Do we need an authorization before we export or don't we? That question is taken up in the second chart in part 732, which I've duplicated here on this next slide. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring us down to a version of that slide that I've made clearer for your viewing. Now, what I would say is the one aspect of the chart in the Export Administration Regulations that is left out is companies need to determine, when they're finding out information about the parties involved in an export transaction, they need to determine whether any of the parties involved are on that consolidated screening list that I talked about earlier. Who are the parties involved in that list of 5 vital questions that you need to ask. And so I have that summarized in the box at the top of this chart. Assuming that you've done a clearance of, or you've double-checked against the consolidated screening list maintained by the U.S. Department of Commerce, whether any parties in the transaction are banned from export privileges, assuming that everybody is fine, you need then to determine, do I need approval basically before I export, or is a license required? The remaining part of this chart allows the exporter, or allows the principal party in interest, to look at different parts of the Export Administration Regulations and determine, are there any prohibitions that prevent me from going forward with a shipment, and if there are, does that mean that I need a license? If I'm clear of those, what are called general prohibitions, and there are 10 general prohibitions in section 736 of the Export Administration Regulations. If we're clear of those 10 prohibitions, can we go ahead and ship without a license? So you'll see from and since really the discussion of how to answer these questions is a much longer process and can take quite a bit of time to go through step by step. We'll leave that for another discussion on another day. However, I just bring up to your attention the fact that the Export Administration Regulations do attempt to provide assistance in navigating the several thousand pages of regulations that are included in the EAR. Now, what are the consequences of not going through a decision tree such as is provided in the Export Administration Regulations to determine, do I need any kind of U.S. government authority or not in order to ship? I would say that the penalties under both the EAR and the Itar are really quite severe. As many of you have heard me say in the past, I really consider them to be bet the farm types of liabilities. Here in this next slide, penalties under the EAR are shown. They're both criminal and civil. They're criminal both for individuals, and they're civil fines for the individuals as well as for the company. And there could be a denial of export privileges for the company as well. You'll see that I think no company dealing in commercial products wants to be subject to criminal penalties of up to $1 million per violation, or have their employees or owners subject to imprisonment and additional fine. The penalties under the ITAR are even more draconian, similar, but civil fines can be twice what they are under the Export Administration regulations. There can be debarment from government contracts, but again, the civil and criminal penalties and imprisonment for individuals and or imprisonment for individuals and criminal and civil sanctions against companies are so high that, frankly, very few companies in the world see these as a cost of doing business, but rather most companies see these kinds of penalties as penalties that are life-threatening. So what are some common export control breakdowns? We've talked about a number of these already, but failure to determine the jurisdiction of your new products and determine the implications of a change in business are really at the top of the list. That could include whether or not you determined whether an export license is needed. Could be failure to prevent a release of restricted information to foreign persons within the United States. It could be a consequence of not having proper server control over your servers and the flow of information within your company. One thing I should mention is that companies are more and more concerned about where their information resides when they upload information to the cloud. Cloud service providers, as well as companies that are users of online services, should be wary and inquire. Customers should inquire of cloud service providers, and cloud service providers should anticipate questions from customers as to where their servers are located, who has access to information that may be on those servers, and are those servers and are those technicians who have access to customer information located within the United States, or are they outside the United States in a foreign jurisdiction? I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about enforcement trends, and for today's program I've reviewed many of the enforcement actions taken both by DDTC as well as the Bureau of Industry and Security for military and commercial products respectively for the last couple of months. And certainly it remains clear that large defense contractors, large companies who are involved with both fabrication of high-level commercial and ITAR-controlled products within the United States and exporting them abroad will continue to be, or always have been, and will continue to be targets for export controls compliance efforts, as has Raytheon, a very large defense contractor, been in recent years. More importantly, for many of you who happen to be with us today, companies in the U.S. supply chain for larger OEMs are also subject to export controls review and enforcement actions at any particular time by both DDTC and BIS. Intevac, a customer of both a customer of several of many Oregon companies, but also they're both a customer and as well as a vendor to others in the area, has been subject to export controls enforcement actions during this last year. In this case, for an improper disclosure or deemed export of information within their organization to employees who should not have seen that information. One enforcement trend that I'd really like to stress today is the fact that the Office of Export Enforcement for BIS, the Office of Compliance for DDTC, U.S. Customs, and ICE, all four organizations have focused very heavily in recent years on enforcement action against U.S. and foreign individuals. You'll see from this next slide that just last month alone, I've shown a number of enforcement actions against both U.S. and foreign individuals. In the case of an Illinois engineering firm, the owner of that company was found guilty of carbon fiber exports to an entity that was blocked for receipt of those exports and was situated on the U.S. consolidated screening list. That owner affirmatively evaded and knew that the recipient was a blocked entity, and yet evaded export controls and made exports anyway. Also, last month, a Taiwanese gentleman was arrested in Estonia for exporting metal fabricating equipment to North Korea that could be used for both commercial as well as missile manufacturing purposes. The interesting thing to note about this case is that this Taiwanese gentleman, a non-U.S. citizen, was arrested in a foreign country and then extradited to the United States for prosecution here. So the U.S. is coordinating much more heavily with other foreign enforcement agencies to arrest and to extradite to the U.S. for prosecution foreign citizens who are found to be in violation of the U.S. export control laws. The same thing in this third case of a Russian citizen arrested in Lithuania and sentenced to, was sentenced to time served, but that time served was 18 months in U.S. prison for conspiring to export night vision devices. What I think is interesting about this case, and something that U.S. companies should be aware of, is that simply because a commodity, part, component, or technology can be purchased openly on the internet does not mean that that product is eligible for export out of the U.S. without U.S. government authority. So the fact that you can purchase something on eBay or other public internet sites doesn't have any bearing upon its export controls classification. Lastly, I'd like to also mention this January or this case about two Taiwanese individuals who are to be sentenced next year for the attempted export of cameras and containing photographs of U.S. stealth technology and UAV designs. Again, the U.S. is very aggressively going after individuals that have a contact with the United States through their violation of U.S. export laws. Lastly, I'd just like to also mention that small U.S. manufacturers have always been, but continue to be, on the radar scopes of U.S. enforcement agencies. In this case, a small Southern California company, which is a manufacturer of hot melt composite layering machines, exported a product to Spain without an export license. Their mistake happened to be that they said, well, Spain's a friendly country. Why can't we sell our laminating machines to a customer in Spain. Well, their laminating machines can be used for commercial purposes, but they neglected to realize that their machines can also be used for high-tech aerospace and fighter aircraft as well. And in failing to determine who the recipient was, that the country was still subject to U.S. export controls, though a friendly country, they were subject to fines and sanctions and problems for their business that will continue for years into the future. So again, a cautionary tale for U.S. Contract manufacturers. We haven't had a chance to talk about so many other topics today, but we have in the past and will continue to do so in the future. Topics such as classification, licensing, the duties of empowered officials, what you do with when things go wrong, and so forth. But I hope today that we've touched upon some of the questions to be asked, some of the topics that need to be drilled down upon for companies when they determine that their business has changed, new orders have come in, and new requests have come in from customers. As I always ask during my presentations, the reason for why should you comply? Why is compliance a priority for companies, and U.S. export controls compliance in particular? There are many reasons. National security goals, protecting the United States, determining a competitive business advantage for your company as a compliant member of the business community. But also, really, compliance is a lot less costly than remediation. And so I hope your company can be competitive and successful in the future. I'd like to end today by mentioning that the Pacific Northwest Defense Coalition, in coordination with other sponsors, will be putting on an Itar Summit January 7th and 8th next year. It will be here in Portland, Oregon, and I invite all of our listeners to attend the Itar Summit next month. If you're interested in looking into much more detail into military manufacturing, military handling of products, and military exports. Also be aware that there are holiday networking receptions sponsored by PNDC, which are also listed on this last slide. So thank you all for your attention today. We have a few minutes left. If any of you on the line would like to stay on the line and ask a question, feel free to send an email if you're so inclined. And my email address is here. Actually, I'll go to this first slide. And my email address is akm@aterwin.com, akm@aterwynne.com. I'd be happy to wait for a few more minutes and see if anyone has a question. So feel free to send your emails to that email address. It's also shown on the screen at the moment. Again, for those of you who are leaving, thank you for your attention today, and have a good day. If you are interested in a copy of the presentation, please let Suzanne Lamb know at the Pacific Northwest Defense Coalition. For those of you who may still be on the line, I will wait for another few minutes to see if there are any questions that are sent in by email. Again, my address is akm@itarwin.com, and the address is on the first slide of the presentation today.